Let's start by stating the obvious. If you plan to conduct a phone call with some senior military buddies about shipping multi-million-dollar weapons into another country during a hot war, you might find encrypting the line is a best practice. I hope Germany is listening. Russia sure was. Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of the Headlines in History podcast. I'm your host, John Mollick. Now, for our first episode, as you heard in the intro, we're going to be discussing a mistake. We're going to be talking about a conversation some German senior military members were having that they wanted to keep secret, and they didn't. So, media reported this week that a conversation was collected, leaked, and then posted online, and um, there were some pretty revealing topics being discussed in the phone call, and hence this is why the rest of the world found out. Now, collection happens all of the time. Countries are always collecting on other countries. Some are better at it than others, and a lot of information is pulled in daily. And it's not often that governments, militaries will release the fact that they've collected certain information and tell the rest of the world about it. But clearly, that's something that happened this week. So who collected the information? Well, the Russian military or the Russian government did, because they came out and they said that they did. And then right after, when I say right after, I believe it was the next day, the German government authenticated the conversation, said yes, that was us. Those were some of our military leaders, and it is true. Um, Everything that was being said in the phone call. So, as you might imagine, what was being discussed was of particular interest to Mr. Putin, because no doubt releasing to the world that Russia had, um, Russia was collecting this information and then posting it, releasing to the world, admitting or letting the rest of the world know that Russia was collecting this information and had it in hand, is something that only that President Putin would give permission to do. So why did he do that? Well, it's about what was in the phone call. Um, Before we dive into the specific details of the phone call, the Kremlin, as you might have imagined, after releasing the fact that they had this information, they followed with a couple of interesting quotes. The first being, quote, "The recording itself says that within the Bundeswehr, so the German military, plans to strike Russian territory are being discussed substantively and concretely," end quote. Sounds typical. And here comes another one, a little bit more with a little more drama. Quote, "If nothing is done and the German people do not stop this, then there will be dire consequences, first and foremost for Germany itself," end quote. And that's both of those come from a spokesman of the Russian Foreign Ministry. So clearly, what was discussed in the conversation was of particular interest to Mr. Putin. The Russian government, they posted the information on Russia Today, RT, which we all know is a website news organization with direct ties to the Kremlin. So call it state-run media. It was the chief editor there who posted it on social media. And also another a little interesting aspect here is that the release of the information came on the same day that they were unfortunately burying Alexei Navalny after his death in the Arctic penal colony, which was um, we, we don't know exactly how that happened. The Russians say that it had to do with some heart attack, some heart issue. Uh, Hard to believe that that's the case, but they chose that day to release the information. So who knows if it's just a coincidence? But knowing President Putin, for those that follow President Putin, it's safe to say, symbolism like that is not lost on him. Now, in response, like I had said, Germany revealed that the leak was authentic. The defense minister, Boris Pistorius, admitted this week that it was, quote, an individual error, quote, from an officer in Singapore, which resulted in the issue. He also added that, quote, not all participants adhered to the secure dial in procedure as required, end quote. And how did Russia come across it? Well, Germany said, quote, comprehensive wiretapping operations, end quote. So, well, let me first say that as an intelligence officer, my stomach hurts for the person that is responsible for this. So, um, it sounds as if that this is certainly not intentional. Some intelligence employee or military employee for the German government is out there just trying to do the right thing, and for some reason, humans are humans. You just make a mistake, and then all of a sudden your phone call gets out there, and who knows how he found out? I'm sure maybe somebody called him or whatever. Hopefully, he didn't find it on social media, but either way, I mean, oh man, my stomach just hurts for this guy or gal, whoever it is, because if there's one thing that you don't want to do in the intelligence field, um, is is release to anybody what you're doing, let alone President Putin. A good news story out of this is what the leadership said about the individual in Singapore um, afterwards, where again, Defense Minister Boris Pistorius said, quote, I am not going to sacrifice one of my best officers to Russian President Vladimir Putin's games, end quote. Well, good news story. Let's hope that this individual is able to keep his or her job. Clearly, the government's behind it, but still, boy, what a tough day. Now, clearly, like I had said earlier, this is the release of this information is something that only President Putin would likely be involved in. Anything that goes into the international media is something that President Putin wants his fingers on. So he clearly went through a risk reward decision process, and said, it's more beneficial to me as president or the Russian military to tell everybody I had this phone call than to just keep the information and keep the fact that he had it and analyze it and use it for whatever other purposes he may have. But at the same time, when you do that, what he's done is he's shown his hand a little bit in the sense that he's revealed what his intentions are. You can't collect on everything all the time. Even the most wealthy countries, the United States, even China, which is a complete surveillance state, not only within its own country, but potentially, or not even within its own country, but elsewhere, it doesn't matter. There just aren't enough assets out there to collect all of the information all of the time. So you have to prioritize. You have to say, I'm more interested in these type of conversations in Poland than I am in Germany, or I'm not so interested in Belarus because we're friends. Whatever it is. So Russia tips its hand a little bit by saying, yep, we were certainly interested in conversations happening in Germany, and we were able to scoop this up. Now, at the same time, the conversation was unencrypted, and so it doesn't take a lot of time and effort to pick up a conversation that's really just out there in the open, at least in a virtual or a digital sense. But still, even if you're doing broad collection, right? Russia is focusing on a whole series of targets, if you will, or a whole series of priorities within Germany. It still gives the rest of the world, particularly Germany, the rest of the NATO countries, an idea of what Russians' collection priorities are. Every little bit helps in the intelligence game. Also, the fact that it was revealed that, again, this collection was just happenstance, that Russia was just throwing a whole bunch of collection assets out there and picking up as much information as they can. That does speak to a certain capability. There are not a lot of militaries and intelligence communities that have the capability to do something like that. Just throw out a wide web, see what happens, translate the information, and then determine whether any of those conversations is relevant to your mission. That takes a pretty robust intelligence capability. I mean, we know that the Russians have a decent intelligence capacity. I mean, they're typically more focused on the human intelligence than they are in the signals intelligence. They are getting better at cyber, but nonetheless, um, it does speak to a certain capability. Now, so let's go to what the conversation was about and why it might have really upset or really sparked interest by President Putin. So in particular, of interest was the fact that these German military, senior military members were discussing the possibility of adding the Taurus KEPD 350 combination German Swedish air to ground missile made by Saab into the fight in Ukraine. Now, the Taurus KEPD 350 is very similar to the British Storm Shadow. If you've been following the fight in Ukraine, you'll know that over the past few months, the British government has decided that they passed along some Storm Shadow missiles that were given to the Ukrainian military for their use. On top of that, in particular, was a conversation about which targets the German military would want the Ukrainians to go after, or would be allowing the Ukrainians to go after, if they did provide this weapon. And the target that they talked about the most was the Kerch Bridge. So for those that know, the Kerch Bridge is the one vehicle bridge that connects Greater Russia to Crimea directly. And the Russian military is using that every single day to support their logistics operations in support of the fight that they're obviously leading in Crimea. So removing the ability to use that bridge significantly hampers Russia's ability to resupply, beans and bullets, ammo, that kind of thing, to their forces that are in Crimea, the most important property, the most important part of all of Ukraine to President Putin. So the KEPD 350, very, very powerful turbojet propulsion air to ground missile, like I said, about a 500-kilometer range, flies between zero point 0.6 and 0.95 Mach. And particularly, it's used against hardened targets that are stationary. It could be used against targets that move a little bit, but it's really not. It's really not used for mobile targets like vehicles or armor or things like that. So it's really kind of the perfect weapon if you're going to go after a bridge to either destroy it or and to put it in a to damage it enough where it's unusable for a period of time, and then it's going to have to be repaired. So it's not the first time Ukraine and its allies have attacked the Kerch Bridge. This happened back in 2022 with a truck bomb. There was no official acknowledgement from the Ukrainian government that they were the ones responsible for the bomb, and but interestingly, the day that it happened, the Ukrainian government on its official Twitter account just simply tweeted, quote, "sick burn," end quote, right after the event. So, you don't need to be an intelligence officer. You don't need to be somebody in the field to put those two things together. It's likely the case that Ukraine and the military was involved. So they understood. They were able to. The Ukrainian military was able to assess how that affected the Russian resupply operations and the logistic operations. So it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility that Germany would be having this discussion and adding their Taurus weapon to go after something as important as the Kerch Bridge. The other part of that relates to that, though, and one of the reasons that the military members were having a conversation, the pros and cons of adding the missile into the fight, was the fact that in order to have a missile like that be as effective as it can be, you really need to have a targeting team that's associated with the missile on the ground. They can be used without it, but it's not as effective. It can't be as accurate. So in the conversation, they were discussing how other countries do it, how the Brits were doing it, and whether the Germans would want to get involved by actually having to send German troops into Ukraine and then acting as that, what we call like an air to ground connection, where the soldiers can say, "Oh, here's the location that the missile's going to go," and then they can dial it in, and it's as effective as it can be. So that's one of the lines. If you listen to the conversation that the German military didn't want to cross, they didn't want to actually put German boots on the ground. And in order for the weapon, again, like I said, to be as effective as it can be, you kind of really need that. From a political perspective, there's a little bit of plausible deniability baked in here for the German government. So, yes, I mean, they authenticated the phone call and they said it was certainly German military officers who were involved, but the politicians weren't involved. And in Germany being a parliamentary democracy, similar similar to others in Europe, it's the politicians who eventually make who will make the civilians who make the decisions on what happens militarily. And so, Chancellor Olaf Scholz already came out and said, "Listen, we have no interest in sending Taurus weapons into the fight, and we just don't want to." We don't want to cross that line. The targeting capabilities require troops on the ground, and we're not going to do that. So it's off the table. So there's a little bit of plausible deniability in there. Russia has to make an assessment as to whether they think this was just a conversation where some senior military officers were bantering back and forth about possibilities, or whether this was some real planning that was happening. Something was actually going to something concrete was actually going to come out of that conversation. Okay, so at the time of this recording, I'm recording here on March 6th, and this was reported. It was really heavily in the media March 4th, and there was a little bit yesterday in March 5th, and things have kind of turned, and it's not the hottest discussed topic, at least in foreign affairs. So, it remains to be seen what kind of fallout will happen between Germany and Russia. I suspect not much. President Putin knows that these conversations are happening all over the place. President Putin knows that this is not technically a fight with NATO, but it is no secret that NATO countries are supporting Ukraine. The United States is supporting Ukraine financially and with weaponry. Many of the European countries are doing the same thing. But what's Putin's motive, right? He acts as if this is some kind of big shock, but really all that it is he wants to continue to add to the pile of evidence, not evidence from his perspective, but a pile of evidence that says NATO continues to encroach on his sphere of influence. It's one thing that Europe is sending some money. It's another thing that they're sending some small arms, but then they really step it up when they start to send armor, larger artillery. That's why there was a huge conversation over the last couple of months about whether the United States would supply ATACMS, which is increases the ability of Ukraine to fire deep into the battle space, which increases the standoff distance for Russia's artillery. That's a big deal. Obviously, President Putin doesn't want NATO countries giving more and more advanced technology to Ukraine because it just causes bigger issues for him tactically. But strategically, he gets to say, see, look at what's happening here. I'm just trying to take care of these Russians that live in eastern Ukraine. I'm just trying to take care of those that are in Crimea, and I'm trying to just defend myself. This is my strategic area of influence, and NATO is consistently screwing with me, and all they want to do is keep sending more and more weapons. Does it do anything for himself in terms of the conversation with the rest of with the West and with NATO? No, because the emperor has no clothes. We can see through all of the propaganda and all of the hybrid warfare games, as they call it in Russia. We get that, but for those that are potentially on the fence, maybe it helps. But at the end of the day, it just adds, again, in his mind, more evidence that he can use if he ever decides that he needs to take one step more. And whether that means attacking a NATO country and seeing where that may lead. But he's smart enough to build a case that if he has to do something more than just occupying the portion of Ukraine that he currently does, he's going to have a whole slew of reasons, incidents, evidences that he can present to the world to say, this is why I did what I did. And, having access to a conversation that includes senior German military officials adding just another advanced capability to the fight, it just adds to his argument. So now some historical context here. There have certainly been incidences in the past that are much more influential, meaning that caused bigger issues than this leak that occurred this week, right? It's and as I said, I would not be surprised if really very little comes out of this. We'll talk about it for a couple of days in the news, but it's really not going to lead to any substantive changes. Things that have happened in the past that are way more influential. Just in the last couple of years in the United States, we had Jack Teixeira, the young airman who actually just pled guilty a couple of days ago to, I believe 18 years, just under 20 years, when he leaked some PowerPoint slides on Discord to prove to his friends that he really was an intelligence related to intelligence. He actually was not an intelligence analyst. He was kind of the equivalent of an IT and information technology individual, but working on classified systems got him the access. Nonetheless, he was trying to prove to friends that he was doing what he was doing, and released some documents again on Discord that they got access to, the friends got access to, and then of course a whole bunch of other intelligence um, agencies across the world got access to as well. So, just about a decade ago, we had the Edward Snowden leaks in 2013. That was a significant issue. If you remember, he was the NSA contractor who, ironically, right now is in Russia, but that's for a whole different discussion. Um, that's Snowden took a bunch of information that it called himself a whistleblower. He wanted to share with the rest of the world some of the activities the U.S. government was involved in that he felt was encroaching on private citizens and was really violating their rights. And that was a big day. That hurt the United States intelligence community. It hurt us. It hurt us pretty bad in the eyes of really our own citizens too. You know, we can whether what the U.S. Intelligence community was doing legal or not legal, you know, I leave that up for your interpretation. Clearly, it's legal when you're talking about the FISA court, but still, it's the perception of what the NSA was involved in. But there was also some implications that came out in the foreign aspect because, in particular, you know, it came out that the United States was eavesdropping on Chancellor Angela Merkel's cell phone for, as you might imagine, political reasons, and that did some real damage to the President Obama's administration, and it took many years to kind of repair the relationship between the United States at the senior level and senior officials in Germany. We had 2009 when we had Chelsea Manning. If you remember, a young soldier who was in Iraq ended up leaking the largest amount of data in U.S. history, 750,000 documents. Basically, what she was doing was just taking as many documents as she could, putting them on USB drives, which actually ended up changing policy within the military. That was a time when, in the right setting with the right equipment, you could use USB drives to transfer data between classified computers, but that's not even something that you can do anymore specifically because of this incident. But anyways, had 750,000 documents went on top of this or was saved on these USB drives. She released all the information, ended up being sentenced to 35 years in prison. Now, one very intriguing story that is of interest to me. I'm a big fan of the World War I era. Was during the revolution, the Russian Revolution in 1917. So, if you recall, during World War I, Russia was involved on the side of the Allies, but they were also dealing at home with Lenin. And eventually, the revolution came to a head in 1917, and the new leadership, after the Tsar was ousted, the new leadership under Lenin decided that they were going to get out of the war. But at the same time, as they were declaring themselves neutral out of the war, they had no interest in continuing. They wanted to focus on domestic issues. At the same time, they were trying to build trust with the people and expose the czar and all the things that he was doing in terms of his relationships with the rest of the world. So they went into the archives and they ended up releasing all of the documents that they can get their hands on to expose whatever the government was doing. Well, in that effort, they ended up exposing a secret deal between the British and the French, which was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And this ties into the story of Lawrence of Arabia and fighting an insurgency alongside the Arabs in Greater Arabia, specifically the Hejaz on the west, but against the Ottoman Empire. It's a whole part of the plan. But ultimately, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, at least in part, was implemented after the war. The Middle East was really kind of carved up by how Europe wanted it to be, and we still feel the reverberations of those issues today, all the way up to the issue with the war in Gaza right now, where Israel is responding to the tragedy that happened there in the last couple of months. So that leak, intentional at that time, obviously, with the new government taking over, but that leak had a significant effect. And then one of my favorites in terms of how the story goes down was the Antietam leak in the U.S. during the Civil War in 1862. So at that time, so we had two soldiers, Sergeant John Bloss and Corporal Barton Mitchell. They just happened upon three cigars that were wrapped in like paper. Two Union soldiers on horseback. They see these three cigars wrapped in paper. They pick up the cigars and they realize that the paper that was used to wrap the cigars was Confederate Confederate war plans, believe it or not. And ultimately, at the end, it was determined that it was General Lee's adjutant general, who actually wrote those documents. They did some handwriting analysis and determined it to be true. But in those plans, in those papers, were plans of how the South was going to cross the Potomac, and where a lot of the Union forces were at their weakest, and how Lee and his army was going to get across the Potomac and be as effective as they could. Uh, Interestingly, ironically, it could have ended up being, and this is why this is such a good story. This Finding these papers could have been so damaging to Lee that if studied well, and a good general got his hands on these things and used them to his advantage, it could have significantly reduced the amount of time that the Civil War was ongoing. But at the time, McClellan was still the general, and McClellan was the first general in the Civil War for the North, who just really, really couldn't get off and attack Lee. He was so scared. So he took the information, decided that it was, even though it was authentic, there were still way more Southern soldiers out there. There were way more Confederates, and of course, didn't attack. Eventually, he was fired by Lincoln. But so that accidental intelligence leak could have been something drastic, and ended up not being at all. Interesting story from the U.S. So, historical context, story of the week. How does it compare? A pretty embarrassing week for the German military. But listen, at the end of the day, intelligence officers are humans, and people make mistakes. It's certainly going to be remembered for a very long time by that individual. It'll certainly be remembered by the German military. But in the grand strategy, it doesn't really compare to a whole host of historical events that have happened in the past that were much more significant, really, in the grand scheme of things. So, like I said, we'll wait to see. My guess is we won't be seeing Taurus air to ground missiles anytime soon in Ukraine, given the fallout from this conversation. That's not to say that they won't end up there someday. And I would also make the assumption that there's going to be what we might call a security stand down within the government, within the German military, and some retraining done to ensure that these conversations don't happen to fall back into the public. So lesson learned for everybody out there, not just those in the intelligence field. Be careful when you're having a conversation with somebody. You never know who's listening. We'll see you next episode.